Clarielle Higgins spat the blood from her split lip and lifted her chin at the whole jeering town. "Auction me then," she said loud and steady. "But every soul here will remember the morning you sold a widow for pocket money." The rope bit her wrists. Mayor Caldwell smiled, and from the far edge of the square, a mountain the size of a man began walking straight toward her through a crowd that suddenly forgot how to breathe. If you love stories where the forgotten and the broken finally get their justice, subscribe and follow this one all the way to the end. Tell me in the comments which town you're watching from so I can see how far Clarielle's story has traveled. Now let's begin. The rope went around her wrists at first light, and Clarielle Higgins did not cry. That was the thing the town could not forgive her for. They had come out into the cold to watch her weep, to see her go soft and small the way a woman was supposed to when the law took everything she had. They had waited 3 months for it, and here she stood in the frozen mud of the square, 24 years old and half a head shorter than the man tying her, and her eyes were dry as bone. "Hold still," the deputy muttered. His name was Elias Turner, and he danced with her at a harvest social 2 autumns back before her husband put a bullet of debt through the both of them. He would not look at her face now. "You're pulling it too tight, Elias," she said. "Ain't supposed to be comfortable." "No," she agreed. "I don't reckon anything today is supposed to be." Behind her, the crowd thickened. She could hear them without turning the shuffle and murmur of near 100 people, most of whom she'd fed at some point, or sewn for or sat up with through a fever. Mrs. Delaney, whose twins Clarielle had helped birth in a snowstorm. Old Pruitt from the feed store, who used to slip her a peppermint stick when she was a girl. Reverend Coyle, who had married her and buried her husband and would now, God help him, say nothing. They had all come to watch. "Bring her forward," called Mayor Micah Caldwell. He stood on the steps of the courthouse in a coat worth more than her whole homestead, a paper in his gloved hand, and a look of terrible patience on his face. Caldwell never rushed. That was what made him dangerous. He had spent 3 months circling her like weather, and now the storm had arrived on schedule, and he intended to enjoy every minute of it. Elias took her elbow. She shook him off and walked forward on her own. "You don't have to steer me," she said. "I know where the gallows of this town are." A ripple went through the crowd at that. Somebody laughed short and nervous. Caldwell lifted the paper. "Citizens of Oak Haven," he began in the round, warm voice he used for Sunday and for stealing. "We gather this morning not in cruelty, but in law." "Law," Clarielle said. Not loud, just enough. Caldwell's eyes came down to her. "You'll have your chance to speak, Widow Higgins." "Will I? That's generous. I didn't think talking was included in the price." "Clarielle." Reverend Coyle's voice from somewhere off to her left, low and pleading. "Please." She turned and found him. The old man's face was gray with shame. "Please, what, Reverend? Please be quiet. Please make it easier for them. I buried my husband in ground. This town wouldn't sell me a decent plot in. I have been quiet for 3 months. I am done being quiet." "The debt is real," Caldwell said smoothly. "Nobody here disputes it. Your late husband, Thomas Higgins, God rest him, borrowed against the homestead. $640 owed to the Territorial Bank, of which I am, as you know, principal trustee. I know exactly what you are. The bank," Caldwell went on, "cannot simply forgive such a sum. That would be theft from every honest depositor in this room. So the law provides a remedy. The debt may be assumed. Any citizen who satisfies the amount takes lawful claim to the collateral." He smiled. "The land, and per the indenture statute, the labor of the debtor until such time as the sum is worked clear." "Say the word you mean, Caldwell." "I beg your pardon." "Servant," Clarielle said. "You mean I'm to be your servant? Say it plain so all these good people know what they came out in the cold to buy." The square had gone very still. Caldwell's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes hardened like a pond in November. "I mean," he said, "that the law offers you a mercy you have not earned. You could be turned out to freeze. Instead, you may keep a roof over your head and clothes on your back in honest service until your husband's foolishness is repaid. There are women in this territory who would thank God for such an arrangement. Then find one of them. Clariel Higgins, he said louder now, addressing the crowd. More than her, your 70 acres along the Silver Fork are hereby offered against the debt of $640. Who among you will assume this obligation and take lawful title? She had known it was coming. She had lain awake every night that week telling herself she was ready. But hearing it aloud, hearing her whole life reduced to a number and a boundary line and thrown out over the heads of people she'd loved, something in her chest cracked clean through. 70 acres, the best water in the valley. Thomas had known it drunk as he'd become. He'd known what he was sitting on. Caldwell had known it longer. Every dollar of that debt had been engineered. She was near certain of it now. Loans stacked and rolled and hidden in ledgers she'd never been allowed to see. All of it aimed at this exact morning, at this exact patch of frozen mud at her. Come now! Caldwell coaxed the crowd. The land alone is worth 10 times the debt. A shrewd man sees an opportunity. Nobody moved. That was the part that gutted her, not the meanness. She'd braced for the meanness. What she hadn't braced for was that when the moment came, when a single decent soul might have stepped up and bought the debt clean and set her free and shamed the mayor before the whole town, not one of them did. They stood with their hats in their hands and their eyes on their boots, frightened, every last one. Mr. Pruitt, she heard herself say. The old feed store man flinched. You've known me since I was 6 years old. You gave me candy. Clariel, His voice broke. I got a family. He'll ruin me. He'll ruin any man who... I know, she said, and she did know. That was the worst of it. I know he will. I'm not asking you to. Widow Higgins declines to remain silent, Caldwell announced dryly. But silence, it seems, is the town's answer to her. He let that sit. He was good. He let the humiliation ripen. Very well. If no citizen will assume the debt, the statute grants title to the trustee of the holding bank. That is myself. The land passes to me, and the widow's indenture likewise at the standard term of 7 years, Clariel said. She'd read the statute too. He wasn't the only one who could read. 7 years of my life for your $640. That's $90 a year for a grown woman's whole existence, Caldwell. I've seen you pay more for a horse. A horse, he said, does not talk back. The laugh he got for that was uglier than the last one. Deputy Turner shifted beside her. Sir, maybe we ought to just... We ought to follow the law, Elias, Caldwell said. As written, bring the ledger. A clerk hurried forward with the great debt book, and Clariel watched them turn to the page with her husband's ruin inked across it. And she understood that in about 90 seconds she would belong to Micah Caldwell, and there was not one single thing in the whole wide morning she could do about it. So she did the only thing left. She turned her back on Caldwell and faced the crowd, and she spoke to them, all of them, in a voice that carried clear across the square and off the false fronts of the buildings. Look at me, she said. Go on. You came to look. So look. They looked. My name is Clariel Higgins. I nursed half your children through the diphtheria in 76. I sat up with your dying Mrs. Ottaway. I held your mother's hand when she passed, and you were snowed in at the pass. I never once turned a hungry man from my door, even after there was near nothing behind it. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. And this is the morning of my life you all decided to be brave about staying home. Fine, sell me. But you'll carry it. Every one of you will carry my face on the walk home, and you'll carry it Sunday when the Reverend can't quite meet your eye, and you'll carry it to your own graves. That's the price. It just isn't paid in dollars. Silence. A real one this time. The kind that has weight. Mrs. Delaney was crying. 2 or 3 others besides. And still not one of them stepped forward, because fear is a stronger thing than shame, and Caldwell had spent years teaching this town to be afraid. Are you finished? The mayor asked quietly. Clariel turned back around. I am. The bid stands to the trustee at $640, going once. He lifted the gavel he'd had made special, she was sure, for exactly this. Going 640. The voice came from the back of the square. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was low and rough as a millstone. A voice that sounded like it hadn't been used on people in a long while, and every head in that crowd turned toward it at once. For a moment Clariel could not see him. The crowd was in the way. Then it wasn't because the crowd was doing something she had never in her life seen an Oak Haven crowd do. It was parting. It was stepping back sideways, anywhere folding away from the center, like water off a plow. And through the gap it left came a man. He was the biggest man she had ever seen. Not tall, so much as vast, built across the shoulders, like a barn door in furs, and greased leather gone dark with wear and weather. A full beard iron and black. And a face, what she could see of it, above the beard that had been ruined once and healed wrong, a long scar dragging from his left temple, down beneath the whiskers, pulling the corner of his eye. He moved slow. He moved like the ground was his, and everyone standing on it was a guest. Somebody near her whispered a name, and the whisper caught and ran through the whole square like a spark through dry grass. McCall. That's McCall. The mountain man. Jedediah McCall. That's the trapper, Mrs. Delaney breathed. The one they say killed. Hush, her husband hissed and pulled her back. Caldwell's gavel had stopped in the air. For the first time all morning, the mayor's smooth face showed something that was not patience. He watched the big man come, and Clariel watched Caldwell, and she saw the exact moment the mayor decided to pretend he was not afraid. This is a legal proceeding, Caldwell said. Not a 640? The mountain man said again. He had reached the front now. He stood a body's length from Clariel, close enough that she had to tip her head back to see his face, and he did not look at her at all. He looked at Caldwell. That's the number in your book. I heard you say it 4 times. And who, Caldwell said, might you be, sir? Man with $640. He reached into his furs. The deputy's hand dropped to his gun, and the mountain man's eyes moved to Elias, just moved no more than that, and Elias took his hand off his gun, like the grip had gone hot. What the big man drew out was a pouch. He hefted it once, and Clariel heard the shift and clink of what was inside, and so did everyone else. He crossed the last few feet to the courthouse steps, and he did not hand it to Caldwell. He turned it over and let it fall, and it hit the boards at the mayor's polished boots, and split its mouth, and raw gold spilled out across the step in the gray light. Nuggets and dust and cold, hard, glinting weight, more than $640. More than twice that. More money than most of Oak Haven would see in 10 years, poured out in the mud like it was nothing at all. The crowd made a sound. One sound altogether. Count it if you like, the mountain man said. It's over. Caldwell stared at the gold. He did not bend to it. A man of his standing did not scramble in the dirt for coin in front of the whole town. And he knew it, and the mountain man had known it too, Clariel realized. It had been done on purpose. The insult was the point. The debt, Caldwell said, and his voice had lost its warm round bottom, is assumed by... He stopped. What is your name? McCall. McCall. Caldwell's jaw worked. Then title to the Silver Fork acreage passes to you and the indenture of the widow, likewise at the term of no. The word fell flat and final into the square. I beg your pardon. No indenture. Jedediah McCall turned his ruined face at last toward Clariel Higgins. It was the first time. His eyes were pale as creek ice, and there was nothing soft in them, but there was nothing cruel in them either, and after 3 months of Oak Haven's faces, she found she had forgotten what that even looked like. I paid the debt, he said to the mayor, though he was still looking at her. That clears the land. The woman's not part of the ledger. She never was. You made her part of it because you wanted her, and there's no law lets you sell a person in this territory, and you know it, and every man here knows it, and they let you say it anyhow. Now see here, Caldwell started. I've been seeing here, McCall said, for a good while, from the back. I've a habit of watching a thing a long time before I put my hand to it. He looked at the crowd then, slow, all the way across. 100 people, and not one of them held his eye. Whole town of you. he said, and there was something almost like wonder in the low gravel of it. And it took a hermit off the mountain to say the plain word. She's not for sale. She was never for sale. He reached out one huge hand toward Clariel's bound wrists. She did not flinch. She had promised herself all morning she would not flinch, not for Caldwell and not for the crowd, and she'd be damned if she'd break that promise now for the one person who'd done her a kindness. She held still, and she held his eyes, and Jedediah McCall drew a knife the length of her forearm and cut the rope from her wrists in a single motion, and the ends fell into the mud. "You're free of it," he said, just to her now. Quiet enough it was almost only hers. Debt and rope both. Clariel Higgins looked up at the enormous, scarred stranger who had walked out of a wilderness she'd never seen to spill a fortune in the mud for a woman he had never met. And for the first time in 3 long months, in front of the whole cruel, breathless town of Oak Haven, she felt something rise in her chest that was not anger and was not grief. "Mr. McCall," she said, and her steady voice caught just once, just barely on the second word. "I don't know what you want for this." His pale eyes held hers. "Reckon we'll talk on that," he said, "somewhere that ain't got so many people watching." And he turned and the crowd of Oak Haven parted for him a second time, and Clariel Higgins stepped over the fallen rope and walked out of that square beside him, her wrists bare and her chin up and her whole ruined life suddenly impossibly her own again. Behind them, Micah Caldwell stood on the courthouse steps with a fortune in gold spilled at his feet that he could not touch, and a crowd at his back that had just watched him lose, and he did not shout, and he did not chase. He only watched them go. And he began very quietly to think. They did not speak until Oak Haven was a half-mile behind them. Clariel walked because the mountain man walked, and the mountain man walked like a man who had somewhere to be and had never once in his life hurried to get there. She had to take 2 steps for every one of his, and she took them because the alternative was to stand alone in the road with her cut ropes lying in the square behind her and a mayor at her back doing arithmetic in his head. "You've a horse somewhere," she said finally. It was not quite a question. 2. 2 horses, one for packing. He did not look at her. Figured I might be carrying something out of that town heavier than gold. She stopped in the road. He went 3 more steps before he noticed, and then he stopped too, and turned that ruined face back toward her. And for a moment, they stood there in the cold, with the whole business of the morning hanging between them like smoke. "I'm not a something," Clariel said. "I'm not a thing you carry out. I heard what you told Caldwell, that a person can't be bought in this territory, and either you meant it or you didn't. If you meant it, then you don't get to talk about me like a pack that walks." The mountain man looked at her a long moment. "No," he said. "You're right. I don't." It surprised her, the plainness of it. She had braced for an argument, the way she'd braced for everything that morning, and instead, he'd just laid his mistake down in the road and stepped over it. "Jedediah McCall," he said. "Folks call me Jed, the ones that call me anything. Most don't." Clariel Higgins. "I know who you are, ma'am." A pause. "Heard your whole name shouted 4 ways in that square. Heard a good deal more, besides standing in the back these 3 days. 3 days. Her chin came up. "You've been in Oak Haven 3 days. In and around it. Watching. Watching. And you waited until they had a rope on my wrists and the gavel in the air to say a word." She heard her own voice sharpen, and she did not soften it. She had done a great deal of softening in her life, most of it for men, and she was through. "You had gold in that pouch the whole 3 days, Mr. McCall. You could have walked up to Caldwell any morning that week and settled it quiet, and I'd have kept a shred of my dignity. Instead, you let them drag me through the mud so you could make your point standing over him. That gold in the dirt, that little show that was for you, not for me." The words landed. She watched them land. Something moved behind the pale eyes, and for the first time the big man looked of all things ashamed. "That's a fair thing to say," he said slowly. "And it's half true, so I'll not argue the half." "Which half is false?" "The half where I could have settled it quiet." He shifted his weight, and the packs on the horse he'd gone to fetch, tied off just up the road, made the animal stamp. "Ma'am, I've dealt with the Caldwells of this world before. You go to a man like that in private, offer to pay a debt off quiet. You know what he does. He takes the money and finds a second debt. Then a third. A man who'd forge a woman into servitude for Riverland, he don't stop because you asked nice in his parlor. He stops because 100 people watched him lose, and there's not a thing he can say about it after. It had to be public. It had to shame him in front of the town that's scared of him, because that's the only kind of losing a man like Caldwell can't undo." He paused. "But you're right that I could have done it a day sooner, or two, and I didn't because I wanted to be sure of you first." "Sure of me?" "Wanted to know if you'd break." He said it without apology. "Watched 3 days to see. A woman who breaks Caldwell owns already gold or no gold because he's got her in the head where it counts. I don't spend what I spent for a woman that's already lost." His pale eyes held hers. "You didn't break. Stood in that mud this morning and told a whole town they'd carry your face to their graves. That's when I put my hand in my furs." Clariel stared at him. She did not know what to do with a man who admitted a thing like that. In her experience, men explained. They justified, they smoothed, they told you the pretty version and hoped you'd take it. This one had just handed her the ugly true one and stood there letting her hold it. "That's a cold way to spend a fortune," she said at last. "It's the only way I've got." He turned toward the horses. "Cold kept me alive 20 years up high. I'll not apologize for it. But I'll not lie to you either, and I reckon that's worth more than warm." She walked to the horses. She did not get on one. She stood and put her cold hand flat against the neck of the nearer animal, the saddled one, and felt it breathe and gathered herself. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "Nowhere. That's the part folks back there won't understand, and I don't much care." He was checking a cinch, not looking at her. "You're free of the debt, free of the rope. The land's clear, and it's yours, not mine, whatever that clerk wrote in his book. You can ride back into Oak Haven tonight and take up your own homestead, and I'll never darken your road again. That's the plain truth, and I'll say it once, so there's no mistaking it." Her hand went still on the horse's neck. "But," she said, "but there's a winter coming that this town has never seen the likes of. I've read the High Country 3 weeks now, and it's telling me things I don't like." He straightened. "And there's a man behind us who just lost in front of everybody he spent 10 years teaching to fear him. He's not going to eat that. Men like Caldwell don't eat losing, ma'am. They dig. And a widow alone on 70 acres of the best water in the valley come deep winter with that man digging, that's a woman I'd not lay a nickel on. So no, I'm not taking you anywhere. I'm telling you what I see and letting you choose with your eyes open, because I already watched a whole town choose for you this morning, and I found I didn't have the stomach for it." The wind moved between them. Somewhere back down the road, faint, she thought she heard the town. The ordinary sounds of it resuming as if nothing at all had happened, as if a woman's whole life hadn't nearly been auctioned off the courthouse steps before breakfast. "You said talk on it," Clariel said. "Back there. You said we'd talk on what you wanted for this somewhere without so many people watching. Well." She spread her cold hands. "Here's nobody. So talk. What do you want, Jedediah McCall? Nobody spills that kind of gold for a stranger and wants nothing." He was quiet a long moment. "I want to not have watched you break," he said finally. "That's all I can rightly name. I've watched a lot of things break in 20 years. Got so I could stand it. Then I stood in the back of that square and I couldn't." He shrugged in enormous slow motion. "Don't know what to call that. Never had cause to name it before." And Clariel Higgins, who had not wept for her husband, who had not wept when they took the land, who had stood dry-eyed while the whole town filed out to watch her ruin, felt her eyes sting for the first time in 3 months, and hated it, and blinked it back hard and said, "Well, that's a poor bargain for $640 in gold." "Closer to 1,500, he said. "In the pouch. I overpaid on purpose." "Why in God's name?" "So he couldn't count it," Jed said. "A man can't stoop to count coins in the mud without looking like exactly what he is. I left him standing over a fortune he can't pick up in front of his town. It'll sit there till dark, and every soul that walks past it tonight will know Caldwell got shamed by a stranger, and hadn't the spine to bend for the money. Something that was almost a smile pulled at the ruined corner of his mouth. "That gold's not lost, ma'am. It's the best money I ever spent. It's buying that man's authority a slow death, one passerby at a time." She looked at him, then really looked past the scar and the furs and the sheer alarming size of him, and she understood for the first time that Jedediah McCall was not a brute who'd wandered into her troubles by luck. He was a man who thought 3 moves ahead and did it cold and did it well, and he had just outmaneuvered the most powerful man in the county in the space of a single morning without raising his voice above a millstone rumble. "You're not what they say you are," she said. "What do they say? That you killed men in the Bitterroot, that you're half animal, that mothers use your name to frighten children in from the dark." "First one's true," he said without a flicker. "Other 2 I can't speak to, never met the children." The plainness of it stopped her cold. She had expected a denial. She had wanted one, she realized, and he had refused to give it to her, because he had said he would not lie, and he was a man who apparently meant the whole ugly weight of a thing when he said it. "You killed men," she said. 3. He held her eyes. "All 3 had it coming, and a court that wasn't crooked would have hung them for what they'd done to the folks I took them off of. But there wasn't a court up there. There was me. I've never once been sorry, and I'll not pretend to be because you asked me plain, and I told you I don't lie." He waited. "Now you know the worst of me, ma'am. Standing in a road half a mile from anybody. If you're going to be afraid, this is the time and place to do it, where you've a clear run back to town, and I'm not between you and it." She should have been afraid. Any sensible woman would have been afraid. She was not. "My husband never once killed a man," she said. "And he did me more harm than any 3 you could name. So I reckon I'm past scoring men by the number of bodies behind them. I'll score you by what you do standing in front of me. And what you've done standing in front of me is cut a rope off my wrists and call me a person when a whole town wouldn't." She drew a breath. "I don't know what that makes you, but it doesn't make you a thing I'm going to be afraid of on an empty road." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then from back down the road toward Oakhaven came the sound of hooves. More than one horse, coming fast. Jed's whole body changed. It was the only word for it, the way the ease went out of him, and something older and harder came in the way a man might look if the ground itself had shifted under his boots. His hand did not go to his gun. It went to Clarielle, one huge palm, coming up flat between her and the road, not touching her just there. "Behind me," he said, low. "Now." "It's Caldwell's men." "Behind me, ma'am. We'll find out together, and you'll do it from behind me." She did not argue. She stepped behind the wall of him, and she hated that she did it, and did it anyway, because there is a kind of certainty a body reads in another body, and hers had read his, and hers said, "Stand there." 2 riders came around the bend in the road at a hard trot, and pulled up hard when they saw the size of the man standing in it. One was Deputy Elias Turner. The other she knew too, a thick-necked man named Boyd Rankin, who did Caldwell's rougher work and enjoyed it. "McCall," Rankin called out, one hand resting easy on the pistol at his hip. "Mayor wants a word. He knows where I am? He wants it now." "Then it's a shame for him," Jed said, "that I don't." Rankin's hand tightened on the pistol grip. Elias beside him had gone pale, and Clarielle saw the young deputy's eyes flick past the mountain man to her. And something in his face was pleading, was sorry, was every bit of the shame he hadn't been able to show her in the square. "There's the matter of the widow," Rankin said. "Mayor says the indenture clerk made an error, says the paperwork's not filed proper, and till it's filed the woman's status is, what did he call it, unsettled. Says she's to come back and wait in town while it's sorted." "Does he?" Jed said. "He does." "That's interesting," Jed said, and his voice hadn't risen a hair, because I stood in that square not an hour past, and heard your mayor say plain in front of 100 witnesses that the debt was assumed and the land passed clear. I heard him say it. You heard him say it, deputy, didn't you?" His pale eyes cut to Elias. "Say the truth now, son. You were standing right there. Did the mayor declare that debt paid and settled, yes or no?" Elias Turner opened his mouth. Rankin turned his head a fraction. Elias. And Clariel from behind the mountain man watched a young man fight the worst fight there is. The one inside your own chest, and she watched him almost lose it. The way half the town had lost it that morning. And then she watched him. God bless him. Win. He said it was settled. Elias said. His voice cracked, but it held. In front of everybody. The debt's paid. The land's clear. There ain't no error, Boyd. He's just mad and he's grabbing. Rankin's face went ugly. You want to think hard about whose side you're standing. I've been thinking about it all morning, Elias said, and now his voice didn't crack at all. I danced with that woman at the harvest social. I tied a rope on her wrists at first light because I was told to, and I've felt sick since I done it. There ain't no error in the paperwork, Boyd. I'd have filed it myself. He's lying, and he's sending us out here to drag her back to a town that already shamed itself once today, and I'm done. Tell him whatever you want. I'm done. For a moment the road held its breath. Then Rankin spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse. You just ended your job, boy. Good, Elias said. It was a poor one. Rankin looked at the mountain man one last time at the size of him, at the stillness of him, at the hand that still had not once gone near a gun, and somehow was more frightening for it. And whatever Rankin had ridden out to do, he decided this was not the morning to do it. He put spurs to his horse and rode back the way he'd come hard, without another word. Elias Turner did not ride after him. He sat his horse in the road, looking suddenly very young and very lost. A man who had just cut his own line to the only work he knew and was watching it drift away downstream. Miss Clariel, he said, I'm sorry. For the rope. For all of it. For every bit of it going back 3 months that I could have spoke up on and didn't. You spoke up now, Clariel said, coming out from behind Jed at last. That's more than 100 folks managed. It's late. Most brave things are, she said. Doesn't make them worth less. Elias swallowed. He looked at the mountain man. He'll come after you both. You know that. He's got the gold spilled on his steps, and a town that watched, and now his own deputies turned in the road in front of witnesses. That's 3 losses in one morning. Mr. McCall, I don't know you, but I know him, and a man like that 3 losses before noon, he don't sleep tonight. He plans. I know it, Jed said. He'll come at the land. It's always been the land. Elias leaned down from his saddle. There's a thing you ought to know, both of you, and I'll say it quick because saying it out loud back there would have got me shot. 2 months back, before Higgins even passed, a surveyor came through. Quiet. Stayed at the mayor's house, not the hotel. I saw the maps he left behind on Caldwell's desk when I brought papers up. He glanced back down the empty road. It weren't a survey of Oakhaven. It was a survey of the river, the whole Silver Fork from the widow's land clear up into the high country. And there was a straight line drawn down at Ruler Strait, the kind of line that don't follow any creek or road God made. Clariel felt something go cold in her that had nothing to do with the weather. A rail line, she said. Elias nodded. That's what I figured. Never told a soul. Who'd I tell he owns everyone I'd tell? A rail line needs river frontage, Clariel said slowly, and now she was not talking to Elias at all. She was talking to the thing unfolding in her own head. The ledgers she'd never been allowed to see. The debts stacked and rolled the exact and patient targeting of her 70 acres. Water for the engines. Flat ground along the bank. My land isn't valuable because of the farming, Jed. It never was. It's the only stretch of the Silver Fork wide and flat enough to lay track along. Caldwell wasn't stealing a widow's homestead. He was buying the right-of-way for a railroad, one dead husband's debt at a time, and doing it cheap because nobody in that town knew what he knew. She looked up, and both men were watching her. How do you know that? Jed said, not doubting, wanting the reach of it. Because I kept my husband's books, Clariel said, and his father's before him. I kept the accounts for half the businesses in that town, before Thomas drank us into ruin because the men who ran them couldn't add a column straight, and I could. I know how a debt is supposed to move, Mr. McCall. And the debts they read out over my head this morning didn't move right. They moved like somebody wanted a number to land on this land at this time. I've been telling myself for 3 months I imagined it. I didn't imagine it." Her hands had begun very slightly to shake, not with fear now, but with something hotter. "He forged a paper trail, and I can prove it if I can get at the ledger. The real ledger, not the one that clerk carries out for show. The bank's book. It'll be in Caldwell's house." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any that morning. Jed McCall looked at her for a long, long moment, and something changed in the pale ice of his eyes. Something she would not have a name for until much later. "You keep books," he said. "I keep books better than any man in that county. It's the one thing my father gave me worth having, and the one thing they never thought to take because it never once occurred to any of them that the widow they were dragging through the mud could read a ledger better than the men who forged it." Her jaw set. "I sat in that square this morning thinking I had nothing left to fight with. I was wrong. I've got the one weapon that man can't buy or scare or drag through the mud. I've got the truth written in his own hand if I can put my hands on the book." Elias let out a breath. "That book's in his study, behind a locked door, in a house full of his men." "I know where it is," Clariel said. "I balanced the bank's accounts for 2 years before Caldwell had me put out. I know the room. I know the desk. I know the drawer." She looked between the two men. "I'm not asking either of you to walk into that house. I'm telling you what I am, so you stop looking at me like a widow you rescued. I wasn't rescued this morning, Mr. McCall. I was interrupted. There's a difference, and before this is done, you're both going to see it." Jedediah McCall looked at Clariel Higgins, standing in the middle of an empty road with her cut wrists and her ruined life and her chin up and her whole self suddenly gathered around a thing she knew how to do, and the almost smile came back to the ruined corner of his mouth, and this time it very nearly finished the journey. "Well," he said, "that changes the shape of it some." "It changes the shape of everything," she said. "I don't need saving. I need the ledger and about a week where Caldwell can't reach me, and enough quiet to build the case. And I need it before he burns that book because the second he understands, I know what's in it, that's the first thing he'll do." "Then he can't understand it," Jed said. "Not yet. Right now he thinks he lost the land to a mad hermit and a widow with a big mouth. Let him keep thinking small. A man planning a rebound don't look for a woman coming at his books. He looks for a woman coming at his gun." He turned to Elias. You just quit your job in front of a witness. That makes you the loosest thread in this whole thing, and Caldwell's going to want it snipped. You can't go back to town tonight." Elias went a shade paler. "I got nowhere else." "You've got a place now," Jed said. "You're coming up the mountain with us till this is settled. I've food enough for 3, and Caldwell's men don't ride that high in winter. Up there you're a witness he can't reach. Down here you're a loose end he cuts before Sunday." He looked at the young man steadily. "It's not a favor, son. It's arithmetic. You know what her land's worth to him now, and you saw the surveyor's maps. You're the only living soul besides us 3 that knows the shape of the fraud. That makes you worth killing to him. So you'll come up high where killing you costs more than he'll pay." Elias looked at the road back to town, the only life he'd ever known, and then at the 2 strangers, who were the only ones in 100 miles who'd stood up in the light that day, and he made the second brave choice of his morning. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, I'm with you." "Good," Jed said. "Then we ride, and we ride now, because Rankin's back in that town by now, telling Caldwell exactly what happened in this road, and the mayor's a fast thinker, and I'd rather not be inside his reach when the thinking finishes." They mounted. Elias on his own horse, Clariel on the saddled one Jed had brought, and Jed himself walking leading the pack animal, because the man was too large for any horse to carry far, and had crossed the whole Bitterroot on his own 2 feet, more times than either of them would credit. They turned off the road within the mile, onto a trace. Clariel would never have found a thread of a path, bending up into country, that rose ahead of them fold on fold, toward the white peaks, and Oak Haven fell away, behind and below them, like a bad dream, a person half wakes from. They climbed the rest of that day. Clariel had thought she knew cold. She had spent 3 winters in a drafty homestead with a drunk husband and dwindling wood, and she had thought that was cold. She learned that afternoon riding up out of the valley into the true high country that she had known nothing about it at all. The air went thin and hard. The wind came off the peaks with an edge like a blade, and the mountain man walked through all of it at the same unhurried pace, breaking trail through snow that came to his knees, never once looking back to see if they followed, because a man who has to look back to see if you're following has already decided you might not, and Jed McCall had decided no such thing. Near dark, Elias brought his horse up alongside hers. "You believe him," the young deputy said low. "About the winter. About it being worse than any we've seen." "I believe he believes it." "That's not the same." "No," Clariel said. "It's not." She watched the great fur-clad back breaking trail ahead of them. But Elias, that man, read a whole town in 3 days from the back of a square and called every move Caldwell made before he made it. If he says the sky's coming down, I'm not going to be the one that argues weather with him. They rode on. The light died in the west, and it was full dark, the kind of dark that has never once had a lamp in it, when the mountain man stopped at last before a shape hunched black against the snow. A cabin low and long and half dug into the mountainside smoke already curling from the pipe, because he'd banked a fire that morning against his return. "This is it," Jed said. "It's not much, it's warm, and it's high, and Caldwell's men don't come here. That's all it needs to be." Clariel slid down off the horse on legs gone to wood and stood and looked at the place that was going to be her whole world for however long this took, and Jed came and stood beside her. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. "You said you'd talk on what you wanted," Clariel said. "Back on the road you put it off. We're somewhere now with nobody watching, nobody at all. So." She turned to face him in the dark. "What do you want, Jedediah McCall? For real this time. A man builds a place like this to be alone, and then he spends a fortune and turns his whole solitude upside down for a stranger. There's a reason. There's always a reason. I've had enough of men with hidden reasons to last me a life. Say yours." The mountain man was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. "I had a sister," he said. Clariel went still. "Younger. Back before the mountains, back when I was still a man that lived among people." His voice had gone somewhere far off. "There was a man owed money in the town we grew up in. Not her debt. Our father's. Father died and left it same as your Thomas. And the town they had a law near enough, the same crooked law they read over you this morning. And they took her for it. 14 years old. Took her into service to clear a debt that wasn't hers in front of everybody, and everybody watched, same as this morning, and not one soul stood up. Not one." He drew a breath that shook just slightly this enormous, immovable man. "I was 17. I stood in that crowd. I was too scared and too poor and too young, and I stood in that crowd and I let them take her, same as those 100 folks let them take you. And she was dead inside 2 years of what that house did to her. And I went up into the mountains, and I never came down among people again, because I found I couldn't stand to look at them. Any of them. Because every one of them was somebody who'd stand in a crowd and watch." The wind moved over them. Somewhere far below a wolf sang and was answered. "So there's your reason," Jed said. "You asked plain and I told you I don't lie. I wasn't in that square for you, ma'am. Not at first. I was in that square for a girl 14 years old and 20 years dead, and when I saw them put the rope on your wrists, I saw hers, and my hand went in my furs before my head caught up to it. That's the truth of it. That's the whole of it. You want to know why a hermit turned his life over for a stranger, that's why. I couldn't stand in the crowd a second time. Not once I'd learned what standing in it costs." Clariel Higgins stood in the dark on the roof of the world and felt her throat close. "Jed," she said. It was the first time she'd used the short name. She heard him hear it. "I'm sorry about your sister." "So am I," he said. 20 years and I'm still sorry. It doesn't wear down. Folks tell you it wears down. It doesn't." He turned toward the cabin. "But I'll tell you the one thing I learned from it, the thing I built this whole life around. A crowd will always, always let them take you. Every time. You can't count on the crowd. There is no crowd that saves anybody. The only thing that saves anybody is the one that steps out of it. He put his hand to the cabin door. This morning I stepped out. 20 years too late for the one that mattered, but I stepped out. And I find I can breathe a little easier tonight than I've breathed in a long while, and I don't rightly know what to do with that. He opened the door on the low red light of the banked fire. "Come in from the cold, Miss Clarielle," he said. "You too, son. We've a winter to get through and a man to beat, and neither one gets easier for us freezing in the yard." She went in. The warmth of the place hit her like a hand, and she understood in that first breath that whatever else Jedediah McCall was, whatever the town said, whatever 3 graves in the Bitterroot said, this was a man who knew how to keep a body alive against a mountain, and that was a knowledge she was going to need. There was more inside than she'd have guessed from the outside. Pelts and cured meat and stores laid by tools racked clean, a whole life built careful and solitary, and turned in the space of one morning into something that had to hold 3. Elias came in behind her and stood and looked around him at the evidence of 20 years alone, and said very quietly, "How long you been up here by yourself, mister?" "Long enough it took some doing to remember how to talk this morning," Jed said. He was already moving, building the fire up, pulling stores down, a man who did not sit while there was work. "You'll both sleep tonight. Tomorrow we plan. That book in Caldwell's house isn't getting itself into her hands, and I want to know everything she knows about that room before I so much as think on how a body gets into it." "You'd go into his house," Elias said, "for a ledger. I'd go into worse than his house," Jed said, "for a thing that lets her end this clean instead of me ending it the only other way I know how." He looked up and the firelight caught the ruin of his face, and there was something in it grim as the peaks outside. "I've ended 3 men, son. I told her that plain, and I'll tell you the same. I'm not eager for a 4th. A ledger's cleaner. A ledger sends a man to a court instead of a grave, and even a crooked territory's got a court that answers to somebody. If she can prove the fraud, Caldwell hangs by the law, or near enough, and I never have to become again the thing I came up here to stop being." He turned back to the fire. "So we get the book. Her way first. The clean way. And we only do it my way if her way fails." Clarielle sat down slow on a stump worn smooth by 20 years of one man sitting on it, and looked into the fire and let the whole enormous day settle onto her at last. That morning she had woken a woman with a rope in her future and nothing at her back. Now it was night, and she was higher than she'd ever been in her life, in a dead girl's brother's cabin, with a runaway deputy, and a killer for a shield, and a war to plan against the most powerful man in the county. And the strange thing, the thing she could not have explained to a single soul back in Oak Haven, was that she did not feel afraid. She felt awake. She felt for the first time since the day Thomas Higgins first came home, smelling of whiskey and other men's money, like a woman with something to do. "Jed," she said. "Ma'am." "When we beat him." She said it like that. When, not if. "When we beat him, and I've got the truth of what he did in his own hand, and a court's got him. I want to be the one that puts the book on the table." The mountain man looked at her across the fire for a long moment. "I figured you might," he said. "Not you, not Elias, not a lawyer, me. I want him to look up in whatever room it happens in and see the widow he tried to auction standing there with his own crooked ledger in her hands, and know right then in that second that the person who beat him was the one he thought was too small to count." Her voice had gone very steady and very quiet, the way it had gone in the square. "He built this whole thing on the idea that I don't matter, that none of us matter. The crowd, the widow, the folks too scared to speak. He built his whole empire on us not mattering. I want to be the one that proves him wrong with a number, because a number can't be shouted down or dragged through the mud or scared into silence. A number is just true." She looked up. "That's what I want, Mr. McCall. You asked me on the road what I wanted, and I didn't have it yet. I've got it now. I don't want to be saved. I want to win. And I want to be the one holding the thing that wins it." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind rose against the mountain, and the first real snow of the deep winter began to fall. The winter Jed had read 3 weeks in the sky. The winter that was going to close the passes and lock the world and give 3 outcasts exactly the thing they needed most, which was time. Jedediah McCall looked at the widow across his fire, this woman who had walked out of the mud that morning and turned in the space of a day from someone he'd meant to save into someone he was beginning to understand he'd never be able to protect, because she did not want protecting. She wanted a fair shot and a level table and her own 2 hands on the weapon, and something 20 years frozen in the big man's chest moved and cracked and began very slowly to thaw. "Then that's how we'll do it," he said. "Your hands, your number, your win." He fed another length of wood to the fire. "I'll get you into that room, Clariel Higgins, and you'll walk out with the thing that ends him. And when it's over, you'll set his own book on a courtroom table with your own hands. And the last thing that man ever understands about the world is that the smallest person in his ledger was the one that closed it." Outside, the snow came harder, and down in the valley, in a warm study behind a locked door, Micah Caldwell sat with a glass untouched at his elbow and a fortune in gold still spilled on his courthouse steps, because his pride would not let him send a man to gather it. And he looked at a survey map with a ruler straight line drawn down a river. And he did not sleep exactly as Elias had said he would not, and he did not rage, and he did not drink. He planned. He got out a fresh sheet of paper, and he uncapped his ink, and in his fine, even hand, the same hand that had forged a widow into servitude, one careful debt at a time. Micah Caldwell began to write a letter to a railroad company 300 miles east. A letter about a right-of-way. He was certain, deliver by spring a small complication having arisen that he fully intended to resolve. He did not know yet that the woman who could read his true hand better than any man alive was sitting in a cabin above the snow line, learning how to survive a mountain, waiting for the one thing in the world that could undo him. He would learn it soon enough, but not tonight. The snow fell for 6 days, and on the 7th it stopped, and Clariel Higgins woke before either man and knew the way. You know a thing in your bones before your head confirms it, that the world had changed shape in the night. She had learned the cabin in a week. That was her way, the way it had always been to walk into a thing she didn't understand and take it apart until she did. She'd learned where Jed kept the flour and how much of it there was, which told her more about their situation than he'd say aloud. She'd learned that Elias talked in his sleep, mostly apologies, mostly her name. She'd learned that the mountain man rose 3 times a night to feed the fire and check the door, and stand a while listening to the mountain, and that he thought neither of them noticed, and that she noticed every time. And she had learned sitting up late by the banked coals while the 2 men slept exactly how she was going to get into Micah Caldwell's study. "You're up early," Jed said from the doorway. He'd been out. He was always out before light, reading the sky, reading the snow, reading 100 things she couldn't see. "I've got it," Clariel said. "Got what?" "The way in. The whole of it." She had a piece of charcoal and a plank he used for nothing in particular, and she'd covered it in lines while the men slept. "Sit down, Jed. I've been up half the night with it, and I need you to try and break it, because if you can't break it, it holds, and if it holds, we go." He came and sat on the stump across from her, that enormous careful lowering of himself, and Elias stirred and rose from his corner, rubbing his face. And the 2 men looked at the plank of scratched lines, like it was a language they didn't speak, which it was. "This is the house," Clariel said, and her charcoal moved sure and fast, a woman entirely in her element at last. "I balanced Caldwell's books in that study for 2 years. I know it better than his own wife, God rest her, ever did. The study's here, back corner, 1 window, 1 door. The door locks. The window doesn't because it's a 2nd story, and Caldwell's the kind of man who thinks a lock on a door is enough because he's never once in his life had to climb." She tapped the line. "The ledger, the real one, the bank's true book, it's not in the desk. Everyone thinks it's in the desk. It's in a floor safe under the 3rd board from the hearth, and I know it's there because I'm the one who told him to put a floor safe in back when I still worked for him and thought he was only a hard man and not a wicked one. I gave him the idea. I gave him the hiding place, which means I'm the one soul alive besides Caldwell who knows it exists." Jed went very still. You know the combination, he said. No. She met his eyes. But I know the man. And a man who forges debts for 10 years doesn't trust his own memory with a number, because if he forgets it, he loses everything. And men like that fear losing everything more than they fear being robbed. So he wrote it down. Somewhere close. Somewhere he could reach it without letting on it exists. And I know where because I watched him do the same thing with the bank's petty combinations for 2 years. She turned the plank. The clock. On the mantel. He unscrews the back, and there's a slip of paper with every number he can't afford to forget. I've seen him do it a dozen times when he thought I was adding a column and not watching his hands. Men like Caldwell never think the woman adding the column is watching their hands. The cabin was quiet. That's how they always lose, Clariel said softly. Every single one of them. They spend so long deciding you don't matter that they forget to be careful in front of you. He auctioned me in the mud a week ago in front of the whole town, and the whole time he was building his little kingdom, he was doing it in front of the one person who could read every crooked line of it, because it never once crossed his mind that I counted. Jed McCall looked at her a long moment across the fire. You're a dangerous woman, Clariel Higgins, he said. I'm a bookkeeper, she said. It's the same thing if the books are crooked enough. Elias let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something closer to fear. You're talking about breaking into the most powerful man in the county's house, going out a window on the second story in the dead of a mountain winter cracking a safe. You don't have the number to accept it's hid in a clock, and walking out with the one piece of paper that man would kill every one of us to keep buried. He shook his head. Miss Clariel, I was a deputy. I know how this goes. It goes wrong. Then let's find where it goes wrong, she said. Before it does and fix it. That's what the plank's for. Break it, Elias. You know that house too. You brought papers up to that study same as me. So break it. And to his credit, the young man did. He leaned in and he stopped being frightened and started being useful. And for the next hour, the three of them took the plan apart and put it back together. And every hole Elias found, Clariel filled, and the 2 or 3 she couldn't fill. Jed filled with the flat certainty of a man who had gotten into and out of a great many places no one wanted him in. The window's the trouble, Elias said at last. Everything else holds, but it's a second story, and it's iced over this time of year, and none of us 3 is going up an iced wall in the dark. I am, Jed said. They both looked at him. I've climbed worse than a townhouse wall and worse than this, he said, and there was no boast in it, only fact. I go up. I open the window from inside, and I bring her up on a rope. She does the safe and the clock, because she's the only one that can, and I'm the one that can carry her weight on a line one-handed if it comes to it. Elias stays below with the horses and watches the road because Elias is the only one of us whose face means anything to those men, and if somebody comes he can talk, and talking buys the seconds we'd need. He looked between them. It's her plan. It's a good plan. I've only fit myself into the one hole it had. Clariel felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the fire, and she pushed it down, because there was no room for it yet. There was only the work. There's one more thing, she said, and you're neither of you going to like it. Say it. We can't just take the ledger? She set the charcoal down. I've been turning this all night, Jed, and it's the piece that matters most. If we break in and steal his book, then the second he opens that safe and finds it gone, he knows. He knows I know. And a cornered man who knows he's caught is the most dangerous thing there is. He'll burn every other paper he's got. He'll invent a story. He'll come up this mountain with 10 men and no reason to keep any of us breathing. Stealing the book warns him. And a warned Caldwell wins because he's got the money and the men and the law in his pocket, and all we'd have is one book and a mountain between us and a rope. Then what? Elias said. We copy it. Clariel's eyes were bright. I read that ledger and I copy every crooked entry in my own hand with dates and amounts and the false debts laid against the true ones, so a court can see the fraud plain. And then I put his book back in the safe exactly where it sat, and I screw the clock back up, and I go out the window, and Micah Caldwell never knows a single thing is wrong. He goes on planning his railroad and forging his papers fat and easy thinking he won. And meanwhile I've got a copy that damns him, and I take my time, and I build the case airtight, and I bring in a real court from outside the territory where his money doesn't reach. And the first time that man learns anything is wrong is when a marshal he can't buy walks into his study and asks him to explain his own handwriting. She sat back. You don't corner a wolf, Jed. You don't warn him you're coming. You let him think he's the hunter right up until the second the trap shuts. That's how you take a man like Caldwell, not with a bigger gun, with patience he doesn't know you have. The mountain man looked at her for a long time. My sister, he said at last, quiet. The men that took her. I never once thought of a way to beat them that didn't end in blood. 20 years I've had to think on it, and every path I ever walked in my head ended the same place with me and a gun and them in the dirt. I never once in 20 years thought of a clock and a copied number. He shook his head slow. You'd have beat them clean, girl. You'd have beat them with paper and let them hang themselves, and my sister might have watched it and known the men that took her got broke by the law instead of by her brother's ruin. His voice had gone rough. I've spent 20 years thinking there was only the one way, and you sat up one night and found a better one. I don't know whether to thank you or grieve for all the years I didn't know it. Clarielle reached across the fire, and she put her hand on the back of his huge scarred hand, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them moved it away. We'll beat him your way, Jed said finally. The clean way, the clock and the copy and the patience. And if it fails, we'll beat him mine. But we'll try yours first. God help me, after 20 years we'll try the clean way first. They planned 4 more days. They planned it until there was nothing left to plan. And on the 5th day, the passes cleared enough to ride, and the 3 of them came down off the mountain in the blue dark before dawn and rode toward Oakhaven to rob Micah Caldwell of the only thing that could destroy him, which was the truth. They left the horses with Elias in the cottonwoods below the town and went the last half-mile on foot through snow that squeaked underboot, and the town lay dark and sleeping and mean below them. And Clarielle looked down at it, at the square where they'd put a rope on her at the courthouse steps, where a fortune in gold had sat spilled for a full day before Caldwell finally, on the 2nd night, sent a man out to gather it in the dark like a thief in his own town. And she felt no fear at all. She felt the cold, clean focus of a woman about to do the one thing she was better at than anyone alive. You're sure of the clock? Jed breathed beside her. I'm sure of the man, she said. The clock's just where the man keeps his fear. They crossed to the house through the black gaps between buildings, and it was exactly as she'd drawn it, and the study window was exactly where she'd said, and Jedediah McCall went up the iced wall of it in the dark, like the wall was a thing that owed him passage, one huge, silent hold at a time. And Clarielle stood below with her heart in her throat, watching a man too large for the world climb it like a shadow. And then the window eased open above her without a sound, and a rope came snaking down, and she took it in both hands and set her boot against the wall, and he drew her up, hand over hand, as though she weighed nothing, as though she were a thing made of paper, and she came over the sill into Micah Caldwell's study, with her pulse loud in her own ears. The room smelled of him, pipe smoke and ink and money. She had spent 2 years of her life in this room, and walking into it now in the dark uninvited, come to take back everything he'd taken, she felt the strangest thing rise in her, which was not vengeance, but something older and quieter, which was justice, patient as stone. 3rd board from the hearth, she breathed. Clock first. Jed lifted the clock down off the mantel with 2 fingers, gentle as a mother, and set it in her hands, and she turned it and found the little screws in the back plate and had them out in under a minute. Her fingers sure in the dark, and there behind the works was a slip of paper folded small, and she drew it out and unfolded it and held it to the thin gray light of the window, and there they were. Numbers. A dozen combinations in Caldwell's fine even hand. And she knew which one, because she knew the man, because a floor safe was a different make than a bank vault. And this number had 4 turns, where the others had 3. And she read it once and burned it into her mind and folded the paper and put it back exactly as it had lain, and screwed the clock's back plate on, and set it on the mantel with the hands pointing precisely where they'd pointed. "That's the first thing you don't understand about me, Micah," she whispered so low only she could hear it. "I put things back." The third board came up under Jed's knife. The safe was there, flush in the floor black iron, and Clarielle Higgins knelt over it in the dark in the house of the man who had tried to sell her, and turned the dial to the number she'd stolen out of his own clock 4 turns, and felt the last tumbler drop under her fingers, and the little door swung up, and there on top of a stack of deeds and papers, and the ordinary machinery of a rich man's crimes, sat the ledger. The true book. She lifted it out with both hands like it was scripture. "How long?" Jed breathed. "An hour, maybe more. It's a long book, and I can't miss a line." She was already opening it, already pulling paper and pencil from inside her coat, already gone somewhere the 2 men could not follow into the country of columns and dates where she was the only sovereign. "Watch the door in the road. Don't talk to me. I have to be perfect, or it's worthless." And she began to copy. She copied for an hour by the thin light page after page, and what unfolded under her pencil was worse than she'd imagined, and she'd imagined a great deal. It was not one fraud. It was a system. It was a decade of it. Loans invented against dead men, debts rolled and doubled and hidden, widows and orphans and small failing farmers, dozens of them, whose ruin Caldwell had engineered one careful entry at a time, always aiming at land, always aiming at water and flat ground and right-of-way, buying a railroad's path across a whole county, out of the misery of the people too small for him to fear. Her own husband's name was there, her own debt, $640, and beside it in Caldwell's own hand, a second figure, the land's true worth to the railroad. $40,000 and the arithmetic of a man who'd meant to turn a widow's ruin into a fortune 660 times over. Her hand shook once seeing it. Then it steadied. Because a shaking hand makes errors, and she would not permit herself a single error, not with this. "Clarielle." Jed breathed from the window. "Light, downstairs. Somebody's up." Her pencil did not stop. "How close to done are we on the road?" Elias would have whistled. He hasn't. It's inside the house. Then it's Caldwell up for water or a man up to piss. And either way, I've got 4 more pages, and I am not leaving 4 pages of the thing that hangs him. Her voice was flat and calm and utterly without give. "Watch the door. If it opens, you know what to do. Quiet. I need 4 minutes. Clarielle. 4 minutes, Jed. I have come too far up too cold a mountain and climbed in too high a window to walk out of this room with the case 4 pages short. Give me the 4 minutes, or take the book and drag me out now, but don't stand there breathing my name, it breaks my count." And Jedediah McCall, who had ordered 3 men to their deaths and a whole town into silence, shut his mouth and gave the widow her 4 minutes because he had learned in 2 weeks the thing it takes some men a lifetime to learn, which is when to stand aside and let a better hand do the work. She finished. She read it back once against the book, every figure to be sure, and then she closed the ledger and set it back in the safe exactly as it had lain on top of the same deeds, in the same order. And she swung the little iron door shut and spun the dial off the number and laid the third board back down and pressed it flush. And there was no sign at all that anyone had ever knelt on that floor. "He'll never know," she breathed, tucking her copied pages against her chest, buttoning her coat over the thing that would end him. "He'll wake up tomorrow, the richest, wickedest man in the county, and he'll go on being it for months, and he'll never once know that the night it all ended was a night he slept clean through. Get me out the window, Jed. I've got him. I've got the whole of him in his own hand, and he doesn't even know he's caught." Jed drew her back up onto the sill and lowered her down the rope into the black yard and came down the iced wall after her, silent as falling snow. And they crossed back through the gaps between the buildings toward the cottonwoods where Elias waited with the horses. And Clarielle Higgins walked out of Oak Haven for the second time in 2 weeks with her whole life changed. Except this time, she carried the change buttoned against her heart, and this time nobody watched her go at all. And that she thought that was the sweetest part, that she had beaten him in the dark, and the silence with no crowd to see, because she didn't need the crowd. She had never needed the crowd. She'd needed the truth, and now she had it. They were 40 feet from the cottonwoods when Elias stepped out of the dark with his hands up and Boyd Rankin's gun against the back of his skull. "Well now," Rankin said. Everything stopped. "Evening, McCall," Rankin said. And there were two other men behind him, rifles up, come out of the cottonwoods, slow. "Mayor figured you'd come back eventually. Said a woman like her wouldn't run, she'd scheme, and schemers always come back to town. Set a man to watch the roads every night for 2 weeks." He pressed the gun harder against Elias's skull, and the young deputy's eyes were huge and white in the dark. "Didn't know what you were after. Reckon we'll find out. Hands where I see them, all of you. Whatever the widow's got buttoned in that coat, I'll be taking it to the mayor." Clariel's blood went to ice. Not the paper, anything but the paper. 2 weeks of everything. The mountain, the window, the safe, the 4 minutes, all of it buttoned against her chest, and a gun 10 feet away that meant to take it. "Boyd," Elias said very carefully, "you don't want to do this." "Shut up, boy. You're the biggest fool of the bunch. Could have kept your job." Rankin's eyes stayed on Jed. "It's the mountain man I'm careful of. Everybody get those hands up high. You big man. I've heard all about you. I'd sooner not test it so you'll keep those hands where God and me can both see them. Or the first thing that happens is your deputy friend loses the back of his head." Jed McCall raised his hands slow, and Clariel understood in that frozen breath that this was the moment the whole thing turned. That she had 2 seconds to decide what kind of a fight this was going to be. That if she froze, if she let the fear have her, the way the town had wanted her to freeze in the square, then everything, the ledger, the copy, the case, Jed's 20 years, his dead sister, all of it ended here in the cottonwoods with a gun against a boy's head. So she did not freeze. "You want what's in my coat," she said, and her voice came out clear and steady and even, a little bored, the exact voice she'd used in the square. The voice of a woman who has already survived the worst thing you can do to her and found she was still standing. "Fine, Boyd. Here, take it." And she reached into her coat. "Slow," Rankin snapped. "Slower than this, and we'll be here till spring," she said, and drew out not the copied pages, but the folded plank drawing, the charcoal map of the house, a worthless, scratched-up piece of nothing she'd tucked in her other pocket, for exactly no reason she could have named an hour ago, except that some part of her had learned this last 2 weeks always to have a second thing in the other hand. She held it out into the dark where he couldn't read it. "It's all here, the whole plan. That's what you want, isn't it? The mayor wants to know what we were up to. It's drawn out plain. Come take it." Rankin's eyes flicked to the folded paper. Just a flick. Just an instant. Just long enough. Because Boyd Rankin was a man who'd spent his life around Caldwell, and Caldwell was a man who valued paper. Above all things, paper was power. Paper was the whole game. And when a woman held out a folded paper and said the whole plan's here, every instinct a Caldwell man had was to look at it, to want it to reach. And in the half-second, Boyd Rankin's attention went to the paper in Clariel's hand, and away from the mountain man's Jedediah McCall moved. She never fully saw it. Nobody ever fully saw Jed McCall move. That was the thing they said about him in the Bitterroot, and it was true. One instant his hands were up. The next, there was a sound like a maul on a fence post, and Boyd Rankin was simply down-folded, the gun gone from Elias's skull, and skittering across the frozen ground, and Jed had crossed the whole 10 feet. In the time it took the other 2 men to understand that the situation had changed, and by the time they'd swung their rifles, the mountain man was inside the reach of the first one, and the rifle was in the snow, and the man was following it. And the second man got one wild shot off into the sky, before Elias Freed tackled him low and hard, the way a boy raised on ranch work learns to bring down a calf. And then it was over, all of it, in the space of about 4 seconds. 3 of Caldwell's men down in the snow, and the widow still standing there, holding out a worthless charcoal drawing into the dark. The gunshot rang off the buildings and died. "That'll bring the town," Jed said, not even breathing hard. Horses! Now! All three of us! Boyd, Elias started. He's breathing. They're all breathing. I don't kill men that don't need killing, and none of these three needed it. He was already hauling Elias up, already moving them toward the cottonwoods. But that shot'll have half the town at their windows, and Caldwell out of his bed inside a minute, so unless you'd like to explain to him what you were doing in his cottonwoods at 4 a.m, we ride. They rode. They rode hard out of the cottonwoods and up into the folds of the mountain as the first lamps were flaring to life behind them in Oak Haven, and they did not stop until the town was gone below and behind, and the sky was going gray in the east, and only then, only when Jed judged them clear, did they pull up on a high shoulder of the trail to blow the horses. Clarielle was shaking. Only now with it over the shaking came the way it always did after. She got down off the horse because she didn't trust herself to sit it, and she stood in the snow with her hand pressed flat against the coat over her heart. Over the pages. The real pages still there. Still buttoned safe. And she started to laugh, a raw, broken, exhausted laugh that had tears all through it. I still have it, she said. Jed, Elias, I still have it. He never touched it. He looked at the map, and I still have the real thing. I have all of it. Every crooked line, I have the whole man. You had a second paper in your pocket, Jed said. He was looking at her strangely. You planned that. You planned to have a worthless paper to give up if it came to it. When did you plan that? I didn't. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. I didn't plan it, Jed. I've learned, this last 2 weeks, to always have the second thing. My whole life men have made me hand over the one thing I had, my husband, the town Caldwell. All of them always take the one thing she's got. So I started carrying 2. So there'd always be one to give them and one to keep. She looked up at him, and the laugh was gone now, and something raw and true stood in its place. You keep the real thing buttoned close, and you keep a decoy in easy reach. And when the gun comes out, you give them the decoy, because a man who's already decided you're helpless will always grab the first thing you offer. They never think the woman handing it over is keeping the better card. They never once think it. Jed McCall stared at her in the gray dawn light. You, he said slowly, are the most dangerous person I have ever met in my life, and I have met men who hunt other men for money. I'm a bookkeeper who got tired of being robbed, Clarielle said. Same thing I told you if the books are crooked enough. And then the exhaustion took her. The whole enormous night of it. The climb and the safe and the 4 minutes and the gun against the boy's head, and her knees went, and Jed was there before she reached the snow. One huge arm around her, holding her up, and for just a moment she let herself lean into the sheer immovable size of him. Let herself be held up by something, for the first time in longer than she could remember. And neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them moved away. You did it, Jed said quietly into her hair. You beat him. Clean. In his own house in the dark, and he doesn't even know it yet. 20 years I couldn't find a way that wasn't blood, and you found it in one night. We did it, she said. All 3 of us. Elias gave us the maps and the warning, and Elias took a gun to the head and never gave us up. And you got me up a wall and down it again and put 3 men in the snow without killing a one of them. She straightened and made herself stand on her own because she was going to need to stand on her own. This wasn't over. We did it, Jed, but it's not finished. All I've got is a copy in my own hand. That's not enough to hang him. A court outside the territory will want the real book too. They'll want to hold his own ledger against my copy and see them match. My copy proves what to look for. But to close it, to truly close it, somebody's going to have to testify that the real book exists and says what I say it says. And there's only 2 people alive who've seen the inside of that safe. You, Jed said. And Caldwell. And Caldwell. Clarielle agreed grimly. So somewhere down the road before this is done, I'm going to have to make that man open his own safe in front of a marshal he can't buy and take out his own true book and hang himself with his own hand. And I don't yet know how I make a man do that. She looked out over the folds of the waking mountains at the valley far below, where Oak Haven was stirring into another day, its wicked mayor still sleeping, easy, still certain he'd won. But I've got all winter to figure it, and he doesn't know I'm coming. And a man who doesn't know he's caught Jed, that's a man who leaves the door open. I just have to be patient enough to wait for the door. They stood a moment longer on the high shoulder of the trail, the three of them, the widow and the mountain man, and the boy who'd chosen right too late, and then just in time, and the sun came up over the eastern peaks and laid gold across the snow, and it was. Clariel thought the first sunrise in 3 months she had watched without dread in her chest. Then Jed lifted his head and sniffed the air, and his face changed. "We need to be inside by dark," he said. "Why?" He nodded at the northern sky, at a bank of cloud, building slate gray and enormous over the far peaks, coming on slow and certain as judgment. "Because that," he said, "is the one I've been waiting 3 weeks on. That's the storm that closes the passes till spring. Once it lands, nobody comes up this mountain and nobody goes down it, not Caldwell, not a marshal, not any of us, till the thaw." He turned his horse for the high cabin. "You wanted all winter to figure how to beat him, Clariel Higgins. Come nightfall, you're going to have it whether you want it or not. The whole world's about to close up around the three of us and hold us here till spring, and there won't be another soul on this mountain but us and the case you're building against a man who thinks he's already won." Clariel looked at the coming storm, and then down at the valley, and then at the pages buttoned over her heart. "Good," she said. "Let it close. I've got everything I need up here, and everything he needs to worry about is written in my own hand, and he doesn't even know to be afraid yet." She turned her horse to follow the mountain man up toward the cabin, and the coming dark, and the long white silence of the winter that was going to change all three of them. "Let it snow, Jed. Let it snow till May. When it clears, I'll be ready, and Micah Caldwell won't know what's coming down that mountain at him until it's standing in his study with his own book in its hands." The first flakes of the great storm began to fall, and the three of them rode up into the white, and the valley disappeared behind them, and the world closed its door. The storm held them for 3 months, and in 3 months a person learns things about another person that no ordinary year could teach. Clariel learned Jed McCall by the way he moved through the small closed world of the cabin. She learned that a man who has been alone 20 years talks to his hands more than his mouth, that he'd narrate a task to his own fingers under his breath, a habit she found she'd started answering, so that some evenings the two of them held whole conversations that were really him talking to a snare he was mending and her talking back to it. She learned he took his coffee black and bitter and would give the last of the sugar to her and to Elias, and pretend he'd never cared for it. She learned that the scar down his face pulled tight when he was thinking hard, and pulled tighter when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say, and that if she waited long enough, said nothing, just kept her own hands busy, he would eventually say it. And in the 4th week of the storm, keeping her own hands busy over the copied pages, checking her figures for the 100th time, she waited him out, and he said it. "You've been at those pages every night," Jed said. 6 weeks now. You've got them memorized, I'd wager. You could recite that man's crimes in your sleep, so why do you keep at them?" Clariel did not look up. "Because if I stop, I have to think about what comes after. After I win." She set the pencil down. "I've spent every waking hour since the square thinking about beating Caldwell. It's the only thing that's held me up, but a plan like mine. Jed, it doesn't end with him in a courtroom. It ends with me standing in a life I have to figure out how to live. And I don't know that life. I've never once had it. I was a girl in my father's house, and then a wife in a drunk's house, and then a widow in a dying house, and now I'm a fugitive in a killer's house. No offense meant." The ghost of a smile. "But there's no house at the end of this that's mine. My 70 acres are legally clear now, thanks to you, and I could go back to them come spring and do what? Farm alone. A woman alone on the best water in the county with the memory of the whole town watching her get auctioned. I've thought about it every night, and I can't make it into a life I want. So I keep at the pages. Because the pages I understand. The pages have an ending. My own life, I can't see the ending of it all." Jed was quiet a while, "I've got 70 acres of my own," he said. "Near enough. More if you count the whole hollow the cabin sits in. And no man on earth's got a paper says otherwise because I never asked one." He turned a snare over in his enormous hands. 20 years I've called it enough. It was enough. Then 2 people fell into it out of a bad morning in town. And I find the strangest thing has happened, which is that the quiet I built my whole life around has started to sound like just quiet instead of like peace. And I don't rightly know what to make of that, and I've been 6 weeks not saying it, and I reckon that's cowardice, so I'll say it now. He looked up, and the pale eyes held hers across the fire. "I don't want the spring to come, Clariel. That's the truth of it. For 20 years I've prayed the winter would end, and I've been ashamed all 6 of these weeks to find I've started praying it won't." The fire cracked between them. In his corner, Elias had gone very still over the harness he was mending, the way a man goes still when he understands he's overhearing something he shouldn't be in the room for. And then delicately, the young deputy set down his work and rose and murmured something about checking the horses, and went out into the cold, and neither of them stopped him, and neither of them looked away from the other. "Jed," Clariel said, "you don't have to answer it. It's not a question. I know what I am, and I know what I look like, and I know I'm 20 years too strange for any life but this one. I'm not asking you for a thing. I'm only saying it because you said you couldn't see the ending of your life, and I wanted you to know there was at least a man on this mountain who could see one for you if you ever came to want it. That's all. That's the whole of it." And Clariel Higgins, who had been married to a man who never in 8 years said a true thing about his own heart, looked across the fire at this enormous, scarred, impossible man, laying his whole loneliness down in front of her like the gold in the mud. And she found her throat had closed and her eyes had gone hot, and she did the only honest thing there was to do, which was tell the truth back. "I watched you climb that wall," she said. "In the dark, iced over. A drop that would have killed you one-handed part of the way, so the other hand could open the window and bring me up. And I stood in that yard with my heart in my mouth, and I wasn't scared you'd fall, Jed. That's the thing I've not said for 6 weeks. Everyone's whole life they've told me you're the thing to be scared of. The killer, the half-animal, the name that frightens children. And I stood in the dark, watching you climb a wall to help me rob a wicked man, and the only fear in me was that something might happen to you." Her voice broke just slightly, and she let it. "I don't know how to want a life either. Nobody ever taught me. But if there's a man on this mountain who can see an ending for me, then I reckon I'd like to try and learn how to see it too. With him. If he'll be patient, because I am going to be very bad at it for a while." Jed McCall did not move for a long moment. Then he set the snare down, careful, the way he set everything down, and he crossed the small space between them, and he did not sweep her up the way a smaller man might have, because he had learned to be gentle in a world built too small for him, and he knelt down in front of her, so his ruined face was level with hers, and he took one of her ink-stained hands in both of his huge scarred ones, and he held it like it was the most breakable thing he'd ever touched. "I'll be patient," he said. "I've had 20 years of practice at waiting. I reckon I can wait on you learning to want a life, however long it takes." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "I'll wait on you till the mountains wear flat, Clariel Higgins. You just point at the ending you want, and I'll spend whatever's left of me getting you to it." She leaned her forehead against his, and for the first time since a man had come home smelling of whiskey and ruin. All those years ago, Clariel Higgins let herself be held by someone she was not afraid of, and she wept. Finally, all of it, 3 months of it, and 3 years before that. And the mountain man held her through all of it, and did not once tell her to stop, because he of all people knew that some things have to come out, or they freeze a body solid, and he had spent 20 years frozen, and would not wish it on a soul. The storm howled outside, and inside something that had been broken in both of them began slowly to knit. They did not rush it after that. They had a whole winter, and no reason to hurry, and both of them had been hurried into ruin before by other people, and were done with it. What grew between them grew the way the ice grew on the eaves, slow and sure, and a little at a time, and it grew mostly through work, because that was the only language either of them fully trusted. They mended harness with their shoulders touching. She taught him a bookkeeper's tricks for keeping the winter stores counted straight. And he taught her to read the mountain, the sky, the snow, the thousand small signs that meant life or death up high. They argued sometimes hard because they were both stubborn as granite, and every argument ended not in one of them submitting, but in both of them landing somewhere neither had started, which Clarielle slowly understood was what she'd never once had in a marriage, a thing built by two people instead of imposed by one. And Elias, God bless the boy, grew up that winter. He'd come up the mountain, a frightened deputy who'd done a shameful thing and spoke his conscience 1 hour too late. He came out of that winter a man. He hunted alongside Jed and learned the high country. He listened to Clarielle walk her copied pages 100 times until he knew the whole architecture of Caldwell's fraud as well as she did. And one night, sitting by the fire, he said the thing that changed the shape of the ending. "You keep saying you'll need Caldwell to open his own safe," Elias said. "In front of a marshal he can't buy. That's the piece you can't figure. How to make a man hang himself with his own hand." "It's the piece that keeps me up," Clarielle admitted. "I've been thinking on it all winter." The young man leaned forward. "You're trying to make him open the safe by force or by trick, and you can't because he's careful and he's guarded and he's smart. But you're thinking about it wrong, Miss Clarielle. You don't make a careful man open his safe. You make him need to open it. You make him so afraid of losing what's in it that he goes to check it's still there himself with his own hands, and you make sure the right pair of eyes is watching when he does." Clarielle went very still. "Go on. That railroad." Elias's eyes were bright now. "It's the whole thing. It's why he did any of it. The letter you saw him planning that first night, the right-of-way he promised them. The railroad's coming to survey in spring. They'll want to see clear title to the whole line, every parcel proof it's all his to sell. And the deeds, the real deeds, the true ones that show how he got each one, they're in that safe, right on top of the ledger. You saw them." He spread his hands. "So what happens if the railroad's man comes to town in spring and there's already a marshal there, a real one from outside, asking hard questions about how the mayor came to own half the river?" Caldwell panics. He needs to prove his title's clean before the railroad man loses his nerve and walks. He needs those deeds. And there's only one place they are. He sat back. "You don't break into the safe again, Miss Clarielle. You put the right two men in that study at the right moment, and you make Micah Caldwell open it himself to save his railroad right in front of the law. He'll do your work for you. He'll hang himself reaching for the very thing he thinks will save him." The cabin was silent but for the fire. Clarielle Higgins looked at the boy who'd come up the mountain a coward, and turned into this, over one long winter. And she felt something swell in her chest that was pride. Real pride, the kind you feel watching a person become who they were always meant to be. "Elias Turner," she said slowly. "That's the ending. That's the whole ending. I've been turning it all winter and I couldn't find the door and you just walked me right through it." She was already reaching for a fresh sheet, already gone into the country of the plan. "We need a marshal from outside the territory. Federal if we can get one, somebody Caldwell's money can't touch. I'll write the case up airtight over what's left of winter, every figure from my copy, and we send it out the moment the pass is clear, ahead of the railroad's man. The marshal comes to investigate. Caldwell, to save his railroad, opens his own safe to prove clean title, and the true ledger's sitting right there on top of the deeds, and the marshal holds it against my copy, and they match line for line, and it's done. It's finished. And the beautiful part, the part that makes it airtight, is that Caldwell does it to himself. He can't claim he was robbed. He can't claim it was planted. He opened his own safe with his own hand to save his own railroad, and everything a court needs was inside it." She looked up and her eyes were shining. "We don't beat him. We let him beat himself, and we just make sure the law is standing there to see it happen." "There's one thing," Jed said quietly. "What?" "The marshal has to believe you first. Enough to come 300 miles on a widow's word and a book of figures in her own hand. Territories full of people with grievances against powerful men. Why does he saddle up for yours?" Clarielle's jaw set. Because I'm not going to send him a grievance. I'm going to send him a case. Dates, amounts cross-referenced against public land records, he can check himself before he ever leaves his office. I'm going to send him a thing so clean and so complete that the only question left is whether the original book matches my copy, and I'm going to tell him exactly where that book is and exactly how to make the man open it. She almost smiled. I spent 2 years balancing that bank's books, Jed. I know how to make numbers so plain that a stranger 300 miles away has to believe them. It's the one thing in this whole world I've never doubted I could do. They worked the rest of the winter on it. And somewhere in those long white weeks, the plan and the thing growing between her and Jed became the same thing, braided together so that building the case against Caldwell and building a life on the mountain were one motion, and Clarielle could no longer have told you where the one left off and the other began. The thaw came late that year, which was mercy because it gave them time. And it came when it came all at once, the way it does high up, the great storm breaking apart into rags of cloud, and a wind out of the south that smelled of mud and running water, and the icicles letting go from the eaves, one after another, like the mountain unlocking its doors. And Jed McCall stood in the yard one morning and read the sky and came back in and said, "Week, maybe less, and the low pass opens. Time to send your letter, Clarielle. Time to bring the law up over that mountain." She had it ready. She'd had it ready for a month. A fat packet of pages in her sure, clean hand, the whole case, every crooked line of Caldwell's decade laid bare, addressed to a federal marshal in the territorial capital whose name Elias had known. A hard, honest man named Silas Boone, who'd made his career on exactly the kind of powerful men everyone else was too scared to touch. Elias wrote it down the moment the low pass opened alone, because his was the only face that could pass in the valley without raising alarm. And he was gone 4 days, and they were the 4 longest days of the winter. And when he rode back up into the yard on a blown horse, he was grinning so hard he could barely speak. "He's coming." Elias got out. "Boone, Marshal Boone." He read the whole packet twice, and he checked 3 of the land records against Miss Clarielle's figures before I even left his office, and everyone matched to the dollar. And he looked up at me and he said, and I'm quoting the man, "Exact," he said, "Son, in 20 years, I have never once been handed a case this clean by anybody, let alone a widow in a cabin. He's coming. He's bringing 2 deputies of his own federal men, and he's timed it. He knows the railroad surveyor comes to Oak Haven the 15th of the month. Boone means to already be there, sitting in that town asking questions when Caldwell needs most in all the world to prove his title's clean." The boy swung down off the horse. "It's happening. It's all going to happen just exactly like she drew it." And it did. But it did not happen the way any of them had drawn it, because Micah Caldwell was not a man who lost quietly, and no plan. However clean survives contact with a cornered wolf entirely whole. They came down the mountain the second week of thaw, the 3 of them, to be in Oak Haven for the reckoning, because Clarielle had sworn from the first night that her own hands would set the book on the table, and she was not going to sit in a cabin and hear about it after. They came down careful and quiet, and they took rooms not in Oak Haven itself, but in a smaller town a half-day off, where Caldwell's eyes didn't reach, and they waited for the 15th, and on the 14th, Marshal Silas Boone rode into Oak Haven with 2 federal deputies, and let it be known quietly that he was in town on a land matter, and the news of it reached Micah Caldwell by supper, exactly as Clarielle had known it would. And Caldwell did exactly what she'd said he'd do. He panicked. Quietly controlled the way a careful man panics, but he panicked. Because a federal marshal in his town the day before the railroad surveyor arrived was the one thing in the world that could unmake him. And he needed more than he had ever needed, anything to be certain. His deeds were in order, his title provably clean, every parcel accounted for, so that when the marshal's questions came, he could answer them with paper. He needed to check his safe. What Clarielle had not counted on, what none of them had counted on, was Boyd Rankin. Because Rankin had never forgotten the 4 seconds in the cottonwoods when the mountain man put him in the snow, and Rankin had spent the whole winter nursing it. And Rankin had been in that study the night after the robbery, when Caldwell, alerted by the gunshot in his cottonwoods, had opened his safe in a fury to see what had been taken, and had found to his baffled rage that nothing had been taken at all. Every paper in its place, the ledger untouched, nothing taken. Caldwell had puzzled over it all winter. A break-in 3 men put down, and nothing gone. It made no sense to him. And a thing that makes no sense to a careful man is a splinter he cannot leave alone. And so the night before the marshal's reckoning, sitting in his study, with the federal law asleep in his own town's hotel, Micah Caldwell finally understood. Nothing was taken, he realized, because nothing needed to be taken. Because you do not steal a ledger you can copy. And the only person alive who could read that ledger, who knew the safe existed, who could turn its crooked figures into a case clean enough to bring a federal marshal 300 miles over a mountain. The day before his railroad closed was a bookkeeper he had once tried to auction in the mud. She copied it. Caldwell said aloud to the empty study, and Boyd Rankin, standing in the doorway, saw the mayor's face go white and then still. She was never after the book. She copied it and put it back and let me sleep all winter thinking I'd won. And then Micah Caldwell did the thing that nearly cost them everything, the thing no plan had accounted for, because it was the act of a man who has just understood he is already beaten, and has decided he will take the whole world down with him. He did not open the safe to check his deeds. He knelt down, and he opened the safe, and he took out the true ledger, the one damning book, the single piece of physical evidence that could turn Clariel's copy from an accusation into a proof, and he carried it to the fire in his own hearth. And Boyd Rankin watched from the doorway, as the most powerful man in the county prepared to burn the only thing that could hang him. Marshal or no marshal, because a copy in a widow's hand was just a woman's word against a mayor's. But a copy that matched an original was a noose, and if there was no original left in all the world, then there was no noose, only the ravings of a bitter woman. He could paint any color he pleased. He held the ledger over the flames. And this was the thing none of them had drawn. The thing that could have ended it all, right there, a decade of crimes, and the only proof of them curling to ash in a rich man's fire, while the widow who'd beaten him slept a half-day off, certain of a victory that was about to burn. But Clariel Higgins had planned for a cornered wolf. She had said it herself that first night in the road, and every night since. You do not warn a wolf. You do not corner him without a trap already shut. And she had known in her bones, that the single greatest danger to her whole clean patient plan was the moment Caldwell understood he was caught, because a caught man burns the evidence. She'd known it, and she had done something about it. She had sent Elias down 2 days early. Not to the marshal. To Oakhaven. To the one person in that town who had proven in a road in the snow that he could be turned. Elias had gone quiet in the night to a man he'd deputied beside for 3 years, a man with a conscience buried under a decade of Caldwell's fear. And Elias had told him everything, and asked him one thing, one only, which was to watch the mayor. And if the mayor ever moved on that safe, to send word fast, and to slow him down any way a man could. And that man was Boyd Rankin. Not the Rankin of the Cottonwoods. Rankin had 2 brothers, and the younger Amos Rankin was the town's other deputy. And it was Amos, not Boyd, who'd stood in that doorway all along. Amos, who had felt sick for a year over a widow dragged through the mud. Amos, whom Elias had turned 2 nights before, exactly as Elias himself had once been turned. "Mayor," Amos Rankin said from the doorway, as Micah Caldwell held a decade of crime over the fire. "I wouldn't." Caldwell turned the ledger in his hands, the flames beneath it. "There's a federal marshal asleep in the hotel," Amos said, and his voice shook, but it held the way Elias's had held in the road a lifetime ago. "And he already knows what's in that book, because he's got a copy of every line of it in his saddlebag, checked against the county records and everyone a match. You burn that book, all you do is prove you had a reason to. You'll be burning a thing the law already knows the shape of, and I'll be standing right here having watched you do it." The young deputy's hand rested on his gun, not drawn, just resting. "Put it back in the safe, Mayor. It's the only card left that don't hang you twice. A man caught with the book might argue. A man caught burning it can't argue a thing." And Micah Caldwell, standing before his own fire with the noose in his 2 hands, understood at last fully the shape of what had been done to him. That he had been beaten not in an hour, but over a whole winter. That the widow he'd tried to sell had crept into his house and read his crimes and crept back out and let him sleep and built a case in a cabin above the snow so clean it turned his own deputies against him so complete that the marshal already knew every line so airtight that even now, even burning the evidence, there was no move left that saved him. That he had been outthought at every single turn by a person he had decided a decade ago did not count. His hands were shaking. "Who is she?" he said, not to Amos, to the fire, to himself. "Who in God's name did I—" "She's the woman who added your columns for 2 years," Amos Rankin said quietly, "while you decided she didn't matter. Put the book back, Mayor. It's over. It's been over since December. You just didn't know it." And slowly, the most powerful man in the county lowered the ledger away from the flames, because there was nothing else left to do, because every road out had been closed. One patient month at a time, by a bookkeeper he'd never once thought to fear. And he set the book back in the safe, with a hand that would not stop trembling. And he closed the little iron door, and he knelt there on his own study floor. A broken man, hours from a reckoning he could not stop and could no longer even burn his way out of. A half day off in a small town's small room, Clariel Higgins woke before dawn to a knock and opened it to find Elias Turner grinning in the gray light. "Amos turned him back from the fire," Elias said. "The book's safe in the safe. Boone rides on the mayor at noon when the railroad man's watching, and he's going to make Caldwell open that safe himself in front of the surveyor and the whole town and prove his own title, and the ledger's going to be sitting right there on top when he does." The boy's grin cracked into something close to tears. "It worked, Miss Clariel, all of it. Every piece. He tried to burn it, and we'd already thought of that. He never had a chance. He never had a single chance from the first night." Clariel Higgins stood in the doorway in the gray dawn and let the whole enormous winter of it move through her, the square and the rope and the mud, the mountain and the window and the 4 minutes, the storm and the fire, and the man who'd knelt down to be level with her face and the plan, her clean, patient, impossible plan holding at every seam. Behind her in the room, Jed McCall's voice low. "You did it, Clariel." "We did it," she said without turning. Watching the light come up over the mountains, she'd learned to read. "All of us. And it's not done. There's a book to put on a table yet, and I said from the first it'd be my hands that did it, and it will be." She reached back and Jed's huge hand found hers, and she held it, and she watched the sun come up on the last day of Micah Caldwell's kingdom. "Get the horses, Elias. We're riding to Oak Haven. I've got a mayor to meet at noon, and I mean to be standing right in front of him when the marshal makes him open his own safe, so that when he lifts that book out with his own 2 hands, the very first face he sees across the room is mine." They rode into Oak Haven at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the town that had watched Clariel Higgins dragged through the mud watched her come back. She rode down the main street between Jed McCall and Elias Turner, her back straight, her chin level, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow. And one by one, the people of Oak Haven came out onto their porches and into their doorways to see the widow return. Mrs. Delaney, who had wept in the square and done nothing. Old Pruitt, from the feed store, who had given her candy as a girl and then given her nothing when it mattered. Reverend Coyle Gray, and stooped in the door of his church. They came out, all of them, the whole 100 who had stood and watched, and this time it was they who could not meet her eyes. She met every one of theirs. "They know," Elias murmured beside her. "Word's all over town of federal marshals here on the mayor. They don't know the half of it yet, but they know something's turning. They'll know all of it by noon," Clariel said, "and this time they'll watch a thing worth watching." She reined up before the courthouse in the square, on the exact patch of frozen ground where they'd put a rope on her wrists 3 months before, and she sat her horse a moment and looked at it, the mud, the steps, the whole cruel theater of it, and then she swung down, and her boots hit the same ground that had held her humiliation, and she stood on it, a free woman, with a marshal in the town and a case in her chest, and she found the ground had no power over her at all anymore. It was just dirt. It had always been just dirt. The power had never been in the ground. It had been in the fear, and she was done being afraid. Marshal Silas Boone was waiting on the courthouse steps. He was a lean, weathered man of maybe 50, with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen through a great many powerful men. And he came down the steps as she crossed the square, and he took off his hat to her, which was a thing no man in Oak Haven had done for her in a year. "Mrs. Higgins," Boone said, "I've read your case 4 times now. I've checked 20 of your figures against the county records, and every one matched to the penny." He looked at her with something she took a moment to recognize, because she'd seen so little of it aimed her way, and it was respect. "In 22 years, I have never been handed a thing so complete. You built me a road I could drive a wagon down blindfolded. I just want you to know before we go in there that whatever happens in the next hour, you already won it. You won it in a cabin over the winter. I'm just here to make it legal." "Thank you, Marshal," Clarielle said. "But I'd take it kindly if you'd let me be the one to hand him the book." Boone looked at her a long moment. "That's not usual." "No," she agreed. "But it's not a usual case, and I'm not a usual woman, and that man built his whole wickedness on the notion that I didn't count. I'd like to be the one that shows him the arithmetic of how wrong he was, with my own hands. It's the only payment I want for the whole of it." The old marshal studied her, and then slowly he smiled under the gray mustache. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, "you hand him whatever you please." They went in at noon. The railroad surveyor was already in Caldwell's study, a nervous Eastern man in a checked suit named Prentice, come to confirm clear title to the right-of-way before his company put down $1. And Micah Caldwell was there behind his great desk, and Clarielle saw the moment she came through the door that the man had not slept, that the careful, smooth mask had cracks in it now, that he had spent the night knowing he was caught and had found no road out of it. And the sight of him gave her no joy exactly, but it gave her something quieter and deeper, which was the settling of a debt. "Mr. Caldwell." Marshal Boone said, easy hat in hand, the picture of a man just doing his job. "Sorry to interrupt your business with Mr. Prentice here. It's about that same business as it happens. Titles. The federal government's got some questions about how you come to own the Silver Fork right-of-way. Land records show a good many parcels changing hands under debt claims these last 10 years, and some of the arithmetic don't sit right with my office. Now I'm sure it's all in order. But Mr. Prentice's railroad's going to want to see clean title before they build, and my office is going to want to see it too, so I wonder if you'd do us all the courtesy of showing us your deeds, the originals, so we can put the whole matter to bed and let this good man build his railroad." And there it was. The trap shut exactly as Clarielle had drawn it in a cabin over the snow. Because Caldwell could not refuse. To refuse in front of the railroad's man was to lose the railroad to admit before the one witness who mattered that his title was not clean, and everything the whole decade of crime had been for the railroad. And so the surveyor Prentice turned to him with a nervous frown and said, "Yes, Mr. Caldwell, I'd want to see those before I wire my company. Surely that's no trouble." And Micah Caldwell stood at the crossroads of his own ruin with no road left but the one that hanged him. He looked up, and across the study past the marshal, past the surveyor, he saw her. He saw Clarielle Higgins standing just inside the door, and their eyes met, and she watched him understand fully, and finally, everything. That she had done this. That the widow he'd tried to auction had walked into his house in the dark, and read his crimes, and built the road that brought this marshal to this room, at this hour. She watched a whole decade of contempt drain out of his face, and something else come into it, and it was not quite fear and not quite hate. It was, she thought, the look of a man seeing for the first time a person he had always looked straight through. "You," Caldwell said. "Open the safe, Mr. Caldwell," Clarielle said quietly. "Show the marshal your deeds. It's under the third board from the hearth, but then you knew I knew that." The room went very still. "Third board from the hearth," Boone repeated, and there was iron under the easy voice now. "That's awful specific, Mrs. Higgins." "I told him to put it there," she said, never taking her eyes off Caldwell. "Years ago, when I kept his books and thought he was only hard and not wicked. Go on, Mr. Caldwell, open it. Show them the deeds." A beat, and everything sitting on top of them. For one long moment, Micah Caldwell did not move, and Clariel saw him weigh it, saw the animal in the cornered man cast one last time for any exit, a lie, a denial, a claim of robbery, and find every one of them closed because a man who refuses to open his safe in front of a federal marshal and a railroad has already confessed, and a man who opens it hangs on what's inside. And there was no third door. There had never been a third door. She had walled up every one of them, a patient month at a time. And so, because there was nothing else in all the world left to do, Micah Caldwell came around his desk and knelt down on his own study floor, and lifted the third board from the hearth, and worked the dial of the safe with his own 2 hands, and swung the little iron door up, and lifted out the stack of deeds. And beneath them, on top of the safe's dark interior plane, as judgment sat the ledger. He stared at it. "The deeds are here, Marshal," Caldwell said, and his voice had gone to a whisper. "The titles. They're all here. They're all—" "What's the book?" Boone said. Caldwell said nothing. "That book right there, Mr. Caldwell, on top of your deeds. What is it?" And this was the moment. This was the whole winter, and the whole autumn, and the whole long year of it. Come down to a single object sitting in an open safe in a quiet room, and Clariel Higgins crossed the study floor, past the marshal, past the surveyor, and she stopped in front of the kneeling man, and she looked down at Micah Caldwell, for a long moment, the man who had tried to sell her, kneeling now at her feet, where he had once made her stand in the mud at his. "May I, Marshal?" she said. "You may, Mrs. Higgins." And she reached down, and she lifted the ledger out of the safe with her own 2 hands, exactly as she had sworn, on the first night in the cabin, that she would. And she straightened, and she turned, and she carried the book to the great desk, and she set it down upon it, and she opened it, and from inside her coat, she drew out her own copied pages. 3 months of a winter's work in her sure clean hand, and she laid them down beside it. "This is the true ledger of the Territorial Bank," she said, and her voice carried clear and steady through the still room, the same voice she'd used in the square, kept in Micah Caldwell's own hand. "And these are my copies made line for line and checked already against the county land records by Marshal Boone's own office and found to match to the dollar. Compare them, Marshal. Any page. Every page. And you'll find the same thing on each. A false debt invented against a dead man or a failing farmer. A real parcel of land seized to clear it. And a note of that land's true worth to the railroad always many times the debt. 10 years of it. Dozens of families. All of it so that this man could buy a railroad's road across the county out of the ruin of the people too small for him to fear." She turned a page and another, laying the man's decade bare in the quiet. "My own husband's name is here. My own debt, $640, and beside it in his hand, the number 40,000, which is what my 70 acres were worth to the railroad. He tried to sell me into servitude in the mud of his own square to steal a fortune, and he did it in front of the one person in this county who could read every crooked line of how he'd done it, because it never once crossed his mind that the woman adding his columns was watching his hands. The room was silent as a church. Marshal Boone bent over the 2 books, the true and the copy, and turned a page, and another, his weathered face going harder with each one. And at last he straightened, and he looked at Micah Caldwell kneeling on the floor of his ruined kingdom. "Micah Caldwell," Silas Boone said, "you're under federal arrest for land fraud forgery, and a good deal else I expect we'll find before we're through. You'll answer for it in a court 300 miles from here, where your money don't reach and your name don't mean a thing." He nodded to his 2 deputies. "Take him." And they took him. They lifted him up off his own study floor, and they put irons on the wrists that had signed a decade of ruin, and they walked him out of his house and down into the square, and the whole town of Oak Haven gathered now, by the news that ran through it like fire, watched their mayor led out in chains across the same patch of frozen ground where he had tried to auction a widow 3 months before. And Clariel Higgins walked out behind him into the light, and she stood on the courthouse steps where he had once stood over her, and she watched them lead him away. He stopped once at the edge of the square and turned and looked back at her. "How much?" Caldwell said. His voice was ragged now, stripped of all its round, warm authority. "The land, the 40,000. It's still yours. Clear title I never got to file against it. You could sell it to the railroad tomorrow. You'd be the richest woman in the territory. Is that what this was? Money? He almost laughed a broken sound. You beat me for the money. Fine. Take it. Take all of it. Just tell me it was for the money, because I cannot stand for it to have been for anything smaller than that. Clariel Higgins looked at him a long moment. It was never money, Micah, she said. That's the thing you'll never understand, and it's why you lost. You thought everyone wanted what you wanted, so you never once saw us coming. It wasn't money. It was the woman you dragged through the mud. It was the deputy you scared into silence for 3 years. It was a 14-year-old girl in another town 20 years ago that you never even heard of, whose brother stood in the back of your square and finally decided he was done watching. It was every small person you decided didn't count. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. You built your whole life on the idea that we don't matter, and 100 of us mattered enough in the end to bury you. That's the arithmetic, Micah. You just never learned to add us up. And they led him away, and she watched him go, and then she turned her back on him, the way he had once turned his back on her, and she did not watch the rest. The railroad came that spring. Not Caldwell's railroad built on stolen land, but an honest one, and Mr. Prentice, mortified by what he'd nearly been party to, was eager to make it right. He came to Clariel Higgins with a paper and a number, and the number was enormous, and he laid it on the table and said the railroad wished to purchase the Silver Fork right-of-way, all 70 acres at a fair and honest price, and the price he named would have made her exactly as Caldwell had said the richest woman in the territory. Clariel looked at the paper a long time. Jed McCall stood beside her, and Elias behind, and half of Oak Haven had turned out to see what the widow would do, because the town had learned these last weeks to watch her for the answer to things this woman they had once watched auctioned, and now could not stop watching for a different reason. It's a fair number, Prentice said nervously. More than fair. You've earned every dollar of it, Mrs. Higgins, after what that man put you through. You could go anywhere, build anything, start clean wherever you liked, a wealthy woman with the whole country before her. I could, Clariel agreed. And she picked up the deed to her 70 acres, the land 2 men had died over the paper of the land. Caldwell had built a decade of crime to steal the land that could make her rich enough to leave this whole hard country behind forever. And she carried it to the stove, and she opened the little door, and she put it in the fire. The town gasped, all of it one sound. Mrs. Higgins, Prentice cried, half rising, what in God's name? The railroad can go around, Clariel said, watching the paper curl and catch. There's other water in this county. You'll find it. But that land was the thing this whole town tore itself apart over. That land was the reason a good man's sister died 20 years ago, and a widow got dragged through the mud 3 months back, and a decade of families got ruined. I'll not sell it to build the very thing all that ruin was for. She closed the stove door on the ash of a fortune. It's not for sale. It was never for sale. A wise man told me that once in a square when nobody else in this town had the spine to say it. Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Prentice. I've spent my whole life learning it. I'll not unlearn it now for money of all the small things in this world. She turned from the stove and she looked at Jedediah McCall and she held out her hand. I've got 70 acres of good water, she said, and a man on a mountain with 70 more, and neither one of us has ever once had a home we chose. I'm done being sold, and I'm done being saved, and I'm done coming down off that mountain to answer to this town or any other. Marry me, Jed. Up high where the passes close in winter, and no crowd can reach us, and the only law is the one 2 people make between them. I don't want the railroad's fortune. I want the quiet. I want the work. I want an ending I get to choose with the one man who ever looked at me and saw a person instead of a price. Her voice did not waver. You said on the road you'd wait on me learning to want a life. Well, I've learned it. And the life I want is you. Jedediah McCall, who had come down off a mountain one cruel morning for a dead girl 20 years gone, who had spilled a fortune in the mud and cut a rope from a widow's wrists and climbed an iced wall in the dark and knelt down to be level with her face, looked at Clariel Higgins in front of half the town that had once watched her ruin and the ruined corner of his mouth pulled, and the scar drew tight, and for the first time in 20 years, the almost smile finished its whole long journey, and became at last a real one. "I've been waiting on it," he said, "since the day you told a whole town they'd carry your face to their graves." He took her hand in both of his huge scarred ones. "Yes, Clarielle Higgins, up high, where the world can't reach us. Yes." They were married in the spring at the church in Oakhaven, because Clarielle found when it came to it that she did not want to hide the thing from the town at all. She wanted them to see it. She wanted every soul who had stood in that square and watched her dragged through the mud to sit now in the pews and watch her wed the man who'd walked out of the crowd, so that the last picture Oakhaven ever had of Clarielle Higgins was not a widow in the mud, but a woman in the light, choosing freely in front of them all the ending she had won with her own 2 hands. Reverend Coyle married them, and his voice shook. And afterward he took Clarielle's hand, and could not speak. And she took pity on the old man, and spoke for him. "You should have said something, Reverend," she said gently. "In the square. That morning." "I know it," he whispered. "I've known it every day since. I'll know it till I die." "Then say something next time," she said. "There's always a next time, Reverend. There's always some soul being dragged through some square while the good folk keep their peace. Don't keep yours again. That's all the forgiveness I've got to give you, and it's the only kind worth anything, which is the kind that asks you to do better." And she left him with that, and it was she thought a fairer justice than the man had any right to. Elias Turner did not come up the mountain with them. He'd found something in that long winter, a spine and a conscience and a way of thinking 3 moves ahead, that Clarielle had drawn out of him page by page, and Marshal Boone, who had seen it too, offered the young man a deputy's badge. A real one, federal, and Elias took it. He rode off that spring to make a career out of exactly the thing he'd learned in a cabin over the snow, which was that the smallest person in the room is sometimes the one holding the thing that wins, and that a man's job, if he's any kind of man at all, is to step out of the crowd. He came back to visit over the years. He always came back. But he made his life in the light of what that winter taught him, and it was a good life and a brave one, and Clarielle was prouder of him than she ever said. And Micah Caldwell was tried 300 miles away in a court his money could not reach, and Clarielle Higgins rode all that distance to stand in it. And she set her copied pages on the table with her own hands, and she watched the true ledger held up beside them, matching line for line, and she watched a jury of strangers who had never once been afraid of the man find him guilty on every count. He went to a federal prison, and he did not come out of it, and the land he'd ruined a decade of families to steal went back parcel by parcel, deed by deed, to the families he'd stolen it from, because Clarielle would not rest until it did, and she spent a good part of that first year riding the county with Marshal Boone's papers, making sure every last acre found its way home. The town of Oakhaven changed after. It had to. A town that watches itself nearly sell a widow, and then watches that widow bury the man who tried it, does not stay the same town. The fear went out of it slowly, the way the fear had gone out of Elias, the way it had gone out of Amos Rankin standing in a doorway between a wicked man and a fire. People began here and there to step out of the crowd. It was a small thing and a slow thing, but Clarielle heard of it up on her mountain over the years. This story and that one, a man who spoke up, a woman who wouldn't stay quiet, and she knew that she and Jed and Elias and a 14-year-old girl 20 years dead had put a crack in something that ran deeper than one wicked mayor, and that the crack would go on spreading long after all of them were gone. But that was the valley's story, and Clarielle Higgins had chosen the mountain. She and Jed lived out their years up high in the hollow where the cabin sat, and they built onto it, and they built a life onto it. And it was hard, and it was honest, and it was theirs chosen freely by 2 people who had each been told their whole lives that they didn't get to choose. The passes closed every winter, and the world went away, and it was only the 2 of them, and the fire, and the long white silence, and Clarielle, who had once told a mountain man she could not see the ending of her life, came to understand that she had been wrong about that too, in the best possible way. She could see it. She could see it every night by the fire in the ruined and gentle face of the man across from her. The ending was this. The ending had always been going to be this, from the moment his boots hit the mud of a cruel square and he walked out of the crowd. It had just taken her a winter to learn to want it. They never did have much use for the town after. They came down for what they had to, and no more. But every so often of a summer evening, they would ride out to the high shoulder of the trail, where they'd stood the morning after the robbery, where Jed had first read the coming storm in the sky, and they would sit their horses and look down at Oak Haven in the valley, small and ordinary, and going about its business. And Clarielle would think about a morning she'd stood in the mud of that town with a rope on her wrists and dry eyes and nothing at her back, and she'd feel the whole enormous distance she'd traveled from that woman to this one, and she'd reach over and find Jed's hand. "You ever sorry," she asked him once, "that you came down that morning, that you spilled all that gold and turned your whole quiet life over for a stranger in the mud?" Jedediah McCall looked down at the valley a long time. "I spent 20 years up here alone," he said, "because I couldn't stand to look at people on account of they'd let them take my sister. And then I looked down into one square one morning, and I saw a woman that wouldn't break, and I stepped out of the crowd 20 years too late for the one that mattered." He turned his ruined face to her, and the scar was soft, now worn gentle by years of a life he'd never once expected to have. And it turned out stepping out of the crowd the one time saved 2 people instead of none, her and me. So no, Clarielle. I'm not sorry. It's the only thing I ever did that I'm sure was right. It's the reason for the whole rest of it. A man gets one chance most times to be the one that steps out. I near missed mine by 20 years. But I didn't miss it. He looked back down at the town. And I'd spill that gold in the mud again tomorrow. I'd spill it every day of my life. It's the best money I ever spent, and it bought me the only thing I ever wanted, which I didn't even know I wanted till I saw it standing in a square refusing to weep. And Clarielle Higgins, the widow they had tried to sell, sat her horse on the roof of the world, beside the man who had walked out of the crowd to cut her ropes and look down at the town that had learned too late. And then just in time, that the smallest person in the ledger is the one who closes the book. And she knew with a certainty that no winter and no wickedness and no crowd could ever take from her again, that she had not been rescued, and she had not been sold, and she had not been saved. She had chosen. She had chosen the mountain, and she had chosen the freedom, and she had chosen the man, and she had beaten a wicked world with nothing but a bookkeeper's patient hand and a refusal to break. And she had walked out of the mud, a free woman, and built with her own 2 hands high above a town that could no longer touch her. A life that no soul on this earth would ever take away. And no one ever did.